Hey, y'all. Welcome to This Plus That, a show about connecting the seemingly unconnectable and why it matters. I'm Brandy, of course, your host. And this is a different kind of introduction because this is a different kind of episode. Today's conversation is with my new friend, Kate Kavanaugh. I first learned about Kate from an old friend, Seth, back around 2018. Because as you probably might have heard in my conversation with Andreas Weber when I'm telling a story about working with Seth in the Carbondale Valley of Colorado on a farming project, Seth introduced me to the work of Kate as well. And back then I had been a vegetarian for several years and was eating vegan at home mostly. And I was starting to consider eating meat again, which, as you might imagine, is a bit of an identity crisis, you might call it. But I was really digging into what that might mean and found out about the work of Kate and her husband, Josh, who co-own a butcher shop in Denver, Colorado called Western Daughters. And Kate, it turns out, had also been vegetarian for most of her life and then became a butcher, which is just a wild story, of course, and you'll hear us talk about part of that in our conversations. And I say conversations because this is actually the first of two conversations that I have with Kate. This conversation was something that happened because Kate actually recently launched a podcast of her own called Groundwork. She releases weekly, and I had just started listening and basically binged most of the episodes so far. And especially after hearing her introduction episode where she tells the story of how and why she went from becoming a vegetarian to starting to eat meat again to then owning her own butcher shop, which is quite a trajectory, of course. She also talks about, in another episode with Alicia Brown that you'll hear us discuss in part of these conversations, a lot about the state of our soil and nutrient density. And after hearing those, I happen to be, if you've read any of my writing or, my newsletters or anything, I write a lot about the idea of nutrient density and as a metaphor and a direct connection between our food and the state of the nutrient density of a lot of our lives. And so, and you'll hear me and Kate sort of explain more about what that actually means. But I started writing, I reached out to Kate because I couldn't not have her on my podcast and to discuss these things. And what ended up happening was that we basically became pretty quick friends, pretty new friends. And we went from emailing really long messages to each other about how excited we were about each other's work to DMing on Instagram back and forth for like 2 or 3 hours to then sending long voice notes back and forth to each other over text. And at some point we realized, maybe we should actually talk as friends before we even record a podcast episode. We had already scheduled at some point Kate's episode to like actually record a real episode on this podcast. And we decided to hop on Zoom before that and have just a friend discussion. And what ended up happening was, unsurprisingly, we talked for a really long time, and we knew going into it there was a chance that we might actually want to publish it publicly, even though it wasn't like a normal interview for either her or myself. We felt like there was going to inevitably be probably some stuff that we would discuss that would be useful for you all to hear. And so we recorded this intro conversation. And again, it's not quite like a normal This Plus That episode, but it felt like a good introduction, not only to our actual conversation, which you will hear in the next episode of the podcast. So this is episode 24. My next episode is also going to be with Kate, and that's episode 25, and we're publishing at the same time. So if you're listening to this, you will already know that you can go listen to the second one as well. This conversation is about 2 hours long. The next conversation is about 3 hours long. And we not only decided not to cut anything out because we are both learning, I think you'll hear us talk about maybe a little not editing ourselves in order to remain likable. I think that's something that we're both practicing in discussing hard topics publicly. But also that, given the fact that we talk about nutrient density so much in these conversations, Kate and I both felt like, like we're believers in long form content. And when long form content is actually dense, when it's nutrient dense, when it has a lot of richness to it, we just don't have a lot of interest in paring it down so that it feels palatable to the everyday public who's so used to hearing short form content that's just quickly digestible. I'm probably going to write about this a lot more soon too, but the idea being that, yeah, when it's meaningful, rich conversation, it's worth actually hearing. And that you, as a consumer of this type of media that feels really nutrient dense, both in length, but also in content, like I've heard people kind of come to me and say, like, Brandy, your podcast is something that I often have to sit with and I have to pause and I have to come back to again and again. And I actually think that's a beautiful thing. I think it's part of why I don't publish every week. I know that these are very dense conversations and dense topics and that it takes time to digest. And I am interested in creating content that is like that because Kate and I have joked we probably mention even in these conversations, like we are not bite-sized people. And we don't have an interest in being bite-sized people. We want to be calorically dense, right? I can go on and on about that more and more. But I think it's worth just noting at the beginning that I am aware that these are very long and that they are also, heavy is not the right word. I think dense is the only word I keep coming back to. They're just rich, I think. So you, again, as a consumer, have an ability to choose when you're full and you need to pause and step away in order to digest these conversations. And when you're ready and hungry to be deeply nourished again, to come back to them and to take time with them, right? So I think these are the only conversations that I'm publishing. This first one technically would have been my second podcast in June. And then I think the 3-hour one with Kate will be the only one that I publish in July. So I'm sort of slowing down the podcast a bit as well right now, and you'll hear part of that in this conversation. So the other thing I want to note really quickly before we get into this is that this conversation, being that it's more like you getting to be a fly on the wall, just listening to two friends talk to each other, I end up showing up at the table pretty vulnerable. And I say that almost that exactly to start this conversation, that I'm exhausted. I've been experiencing insomnia to a degree that I think I've never experienced it. And I'm wrestling with the tensions between work and rest and my connections to work, feeling like they're unhealthy. That, yeah, my attachment to work is expressing itself in a way that doesn't feel healthy to me. And I'm doing a lot of disentangling around the way that I show up to work or even life and doing things that feel like pleasure that I make feel like work. So that I end up exhausted so often. And I think a lot of you are going to resonate with that. And also the idea that, work or let me say rest rather often seems like this luxurious thing that like is just a long vacation that just seems really like beautiful and, amazing that we would all love to do if we got the opportunity, like I'm doing right now, taking a lot of time off of work and doing a lot of healing work instead. And I call it healing work because it is actually work, even though it looks like rest. It's kind of quite terrifying and difficult to stop when you've been spending your whole life doing and doing and doing and doing. And I think if you're like me, a lot of you might resonate with this feeling that if you stop at any point, you'll be overcome with all the things that you've been like, all the trauma trapped in your body and all the things that have been stuck in you for so long. And so, yeah, this is just a really real conversation, a vulnerable conversation that I have with Kate, really focused a lot on me and what I'm going through right now in terms of the tensions between work and rest that I'm experiencing right now, and doing some healing work around that. So I don't want to go on too much longer. I just wanted to give you that brief introduction to this conversation, but you're going to hear us talk about really a lot of things, like how our health journeys and healing journeys are often a mirror for our physical journeys, how the earth is a mirror of our individual pain and vice versa, allowing healing to sometimes be passive. Like we don't have to keep doing and doing and doing, and letting it happen rather than making it happen. Reclaiming your self-sovereignty when you've been outsourcing your healing to so many others, like I've been doing recently. We also talk about healing as a birthright, because nature wants us to heal, and that humans are part of nature, of course. And I say of course, but that's actually something that has been culturally dissected, that we are, I think, healing our relationship to and realizing that humans are part of nature. Kate and I also talk about our dental journeys, including dental cavitation work, as you've heard me talk about before, airway work, and sleep issues, of course, like my insomnia and other related things, and the connections between fertility and nutrient density even, which is a difficult conversation to talk about publicly, and especially right now with what's going on in the world around abortion rights and, yeah, fertility and reproductive justice. So a bit of a trigger warning on that, I guess. If you've had fertility issues, know that we talk about that and part of the connection between that and nutrient deficiency. And just, of course, in 2 hours' time, a whole lot more. So without further ado, please enjoy this conversation, this very rich, meaningful, connected conversation between myself and Kate Kavanaugh on the connections between work plus rest. I'm coming to the table today in a very I'm very tired and also feel a little fire hosey. Like part of my move to Boulder, which I'm sure we're going to get into more, was of course around dental cavitations.
I want to hear about that.
I sold my house in order to afford doing dental cavitation stuff, removal. And yeah, that was, of course, just a whole process. I owned my house in Denver for like 6 years. It had black mold in it, so that was also part of the sale of the house. And yeah, once I got here, I had like more money at one time than I've ever had, because I had just sold my house. And I was so inclined to be like, let's fucking heal. Like I was just like, let's get into this. And I had already started a lot of the dental procedure stuff, like my path toward the cavitation removal. But I was like, let's do acupuncture. Let's do like chiropractic. Let's do, what else was I doing? Craniosacral work. Some therapy here and there. Like I was just like, I've got the money and I'm gonna heal.
Yeah.
And I realized all this, like all of a sudden, that I was like, I was overtaxing, you know this well, I'm sure, like detox responses. Like I was overtaxing my system and healing too hard. And my nervous system was like, whoa, this is too many things.
Oh yeah, I've been there.
Yeah. And so it wasn't like a normal detox stuff, it was like it wasn't like I don't know, like I've done the GAPS diet and all. It wasn't physical so much as it was spiritual. Like it was like, this is just too many things. And we can get into this more, but like not to dump this on you at the beginning, but I was just like, I've been in a space of realizing that I feel like my core sort of spiritual wounding is actually like I don't feel safe in the world. And I learned this behavior of like constantly doing in order to survive. And I had this like really difficult conversation with my closest friends here last week, Lauren, being one of them, where we were talking about Lauren and her brother Kyle are just like really incredible at typing. Like they have like a ton of like identity knowledge, like Myers-Briggs, and like really adept at talking about like purpose and like your like sort of what you're made to do in the world. And so we were talking about that with me last week because I've been really struggling about whether or not I want to continue the podcast and like just where I'm at in the world right now.
Yeah.
And yeah, we got to this point where they were like, we think you can continue, Brittany. Like, you know what you want to do in the world, basically, but you keep running into this block, which is you make everything work. Like, I can't live life at all without making it into work. And so I'm exhausted by everything. And it's just really difficult to hear your closest friends be like, sometimes we have a hard time being like, you turn basically anything that might be fun into something that's actually like heavy. And I was like, wow, that's really difficult to hear from your closest friends, but like needed. And it's not like I don't know that internally, but anyway,
As somebody,
I'm rambling at you, but
you're not. And I think that this is part of the journey. And I think as somebody, I mean, throughout my life, I've been told how heavy I am just as a human being.
yeah,
And how much
yeah,
weight I bring to everything.
yeah,
And I've done a lot of work recently on finding levity with myself. Like,
yeah,
forget about other people and how other people perceive me. Like, that's too
totally.
much for right now. But like, how can I find some? Does it have to
Yeah,
be so heavy? Is something that I'm
yeah,
working on asking myself as I carry. I want to carry things, right? Like that
yeah,
is my nature, is to strap it onto my back and to pick it up and to carry it. And now my question is like, could I set this down?
yeah,
Does it have to be so heavy?
yeah, totally. And I think that like I've learned that the like heaviness or like not the heaviness, but the I think the too muchness or whatever that we're both expressing that people have felt
Mm-hmm.
about us and our lives is a gift.
Yes.
And I think that's part of why like we probably are this plus that sorts of people that like complexity and nuance are a lot and they feel like too much for a lot of people to carry. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so I think complexity is a gift, but like you're saying, like for me, it's like come to a point where it's like for my own sanity and like functioning in the
Yes.
world, like I just can't operate that way anymore. Like it's like I can't cook my own food. I can't like even going on walks in the morning where it's like beautiful here. It's like a task I'm checking off instead of like
Oh God, I relate to
uh
I checked that task off today.
yeah.
As a task.
Right. Yeah. And so um yeah, I this also feels like the deepest period of self intimacy and also intimacy and friendships and relationships that I've had ever, probably. And, you know, I think that's part also of like this is a part of the bigger conversation that's like when you start engaging in like, where's my food from? What's wrong with the soil? What does meat mean for me? Like all of those things. Like it's such a deep self exploration that like it's no surprise to me that like in this period where I'm doing like I've invested very heavily, like more heavily than ever in my own self healing, that a lot of that is just like a deep emotional spiritual excavation
I
and
was
realizing like everywhere I go now it's like also constant conflict, and conflict in a good way, but like people who are also like these friendships like with Lauren and Kyle and our sort of surrounding community that are like actually willing to like be in that and even
That's
voice
fair.
things like they did last week, right? Like it takes a lot of like I think emotional maturity and
Mhm.
like being willing to hold complexity to actually engage in deep intimacy. And so it's like I'm also constantly like in like conflict and having to like voice things to people or have them voice things to me where it's like, oh my God, it's just like all the time everywhere.
I think too, it's funny that you said excavation because I was thinking about cavitation surgery, which is
Mm,
such an excavation of literal tissues.
yeah.
And I think
And
that
in deep infection.
yeah. And so I
Yeah.
think when you're going through the healing process, I think oftentimes your spiritual and mental journey mirrors that aspect of your physical journey, and you're in a
Hmm.
process of excavation. And so I
Yeah.
think you can't just pull one thing up, right? Like
Yeah.
you pull out that big bulldozer, you can't just selectively pull out like a couple of rocks. Like you have to unearth
Yeah.
a lot
All the
all at
things.
once. Yeah.
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 Yeah, and so it really is like a learning how to mediate that well, like find moments of levity, but also not just like completely shut down and stop engaging in the healing. Um,
Also,
or sometimes to like allow yourself, like,
how can healing be passive sometimes? It doesn't
yeah,
always
totally.
have to be active.
Totally. Yeah, that's a good point. And I also like listening to your first episode, like your intro episode of your podcast. I heard you say like healing is like our fucking birthright, like and it's like I sort of paused and like started almost crying because I was just like sometimes it like I think part of my even like this sort of moment where I hit like an um like that sort of detox response that was like, whoa, I'm doing too much healing, and stopped all the body work. Like I've been pausing on all of that recently, and also just at a place in between cavitation stuff that like there's not really anything I can do until I decide to go apparently through major jaw surgery, which is a whole other thing. But so I'm just like on a pause. And I think I realized too that like I think I and so much of us, like when we get into this journey, tend to like outsource our healing to other people. And I think like hypervigilance in that way too, that it's like all these people have all the answers and it's such specific knowledge. And how am I going to get access to that specific knowledge? And all these people have like conflicting opinions. I have to spend my time constantly looking at like what's right and what do I feel and like deciphering and discerning between what feels right for me. And like it's just so constant. And like, you know, last night even like part of what sort of came up for me was like realizing like Lauren even has all this like a wild amount of knowledge. Like she used to work with Chris Kresser, also has all this like identity knowledge and stuff. And it's hard to feel like I'm not constantly at this place of like lack where I'm like, oh my God, how can I get all of your time always to tell me all the things that you know so that I can like download and I can heal as fast as possible. And just realizing that like I think part of the like pause for me is trying to get back into a place of like self sovereignty and
Yes.
just being like healing is in me. Like you and Alicia were talking about in your episode with her on farming with intention, that it's um, like nature and our own bodies like want to heal.
Yes.
Like healing is already inside of us, and instead of like this constant posture of like I have to find the right practitioner, I have to find like the next healing modality, and like once I dig into that healing modality I realize all of a sudden that there's something else that's wrong with me. Like
Mm-hmm.
so yeah,
I
just
think
like whew.
I spent, this healing journey has been my entire adult life and could
Yeah,
have been my childhood if I mean, it was in
yeah.
some ways. I mean, there was some breaking that happened in childhood. And
Well,
I
even
have,
deciding to be vegetarian, I mean, even though that's like something that you've moved away from, that for you at the time was, I'm sure, like seeing a brokenness, like that
yeah,
the industrial ag is like not actually good for
yeah.
us.
And it was an
Um,
avoidance of death also.
yeah, totally.
And I saw my death. There was a lot of death in my childhood, and I was really trying to avoid that, which I was seeing around me. But I think one of the biggest, most pivotal moments in my healing journey, and I feel I am the healthiest, I feel the healthiest I've ever felt my entire life right
Yeah.
now. I have no benchmark to compare this to. I have surpassed any level of health that I have ever had in
Mm-hmm.
my 33 years. Was that I was sitting at this constant tension between outsourcing my power to practitioners that I believed were
Mm-hmm.
the path,
Yeah.
and doing endless research to help support those healing modalities, and as well to make decisions for myself because
Right.
doing my own research is so important to me. And all of the sudden, I had this moment last summer. Um, I had done this program. I had invested a lot of time and some money into it, and they were really preventing me from doing some things I really wanted to do in my life. And I realized that I had just like outsourced my healing to them, and
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to do that anymore. And I think that decision really changed some things for me.
Mm-hmm.
And looking at that through that lens of like, if I am a part of nature, which I know that I am, and I'm not separate from it, then I see infinite healing potential in nature. And I see this through regenerative ag, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I had a moment, we were up at a friend of ours ranch in Montana, and he had bought this piece of land, and all the old timers in the area had talked about a creek that ran through it.
Mm-hmm.
And the creek had been gone for over a decade. And he started rotationally grazing cattle on the land, and the creek came back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you were
Something,
telling this story to Alicia. Yeah, it's so
yeah.
powerful.
And we have that same power. And I think about, like even our old barns out there, like nature just wants to climb up and eat them and take them over. We
Mm-hmm.
have to we have to like cut nature back from our buildings so that it doesn't just consume it. and
Mm-hmm.
and that force, that consumptive force of healing of is innate in our bodies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's what I find so much. I think inspiration. I don't know if you've ever heard of. Do you know who Andreas Weber is?
I just listened to your podcast with him.
Oh yeah.
I
Great.
didn't before then. I wish I had. He sounds. I can't wait to. It's on my reading list now.
Yeah, he's incredible. Yeah, but I think that's why I found so much inspiration in his book at the time when I came across it, and just have continued to like I think you're sort of voicing that like meat or like healing or like whatever it is that surrounds what you do in the world just feels like your soul's contract and being here, like part of
It is.
what you're meant to do. And I think for me, when I read Andreas, and what I've realized since is that like I feel like part of my contract is that message around aliveness, but like in a particular lens for me. But I think the original inspiration from that from him for me was that like in his language he uses the language of biology, but like that's nature, like basically just saying that like all life is trending toward more life. Like everything wants to be more and more and more alive. Um, and so, yeah, I think that like a lot of the work I've been doing is really just a message over and over again about how it is we become more alive or like open up the pathways of our aliveness, which I guess like in a Chinese medicine way would be more like how do we how do we identify and then maybe open up the places that are blocked, like the flow that is blocked in our lives, which I
I
think
love
also
that.
in a health way is like for me has been looking at like sort of applying the metaphor of toxic load to everything I do, like that everything can or can't like can be a type of toxic load. So if we're doing work that doesn't matter to us, that's or like work that stresses us out too much, like that's a kind of toxic load or blocking the flow of aliveness. And yeah, I think as with everything, right? Like you teach what you most need to know. Like I'm just in a constant process of seeing more and more like what it is that blocks my own aliveness.
I love
And yeah,
that.
part of that has, go ahead.
Oh, I was thinking, I've done some emotional work too, right? Like, I mean, this is all part and parcel of healing. And then,
Mm-hmm.
you go through so many healing modalities and you're like, okay, well, maybe it's in my head, but it's not like a crazy in my head. It's just a physiological, top down response that I'm integrating into my body. But through one of the last, my coach from this last round of emotional healing work likes to say that you can't selectively numb, and this is for me, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is my problem. That when you numb life's pains, you also numb life's joys, which I think
Mm-hmm.
in so many ways is that aspect of aliveness.
Mm-hmm.
And as somebody who's been through a lot of emotional pain and bears a lot of emotional pain, right? Like I feel, for me, that veil is thin between what earth is experiencing and what
Mm-hmm.
comes into my space.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm apt to take on emotional pain. That's part of the enmeshment of my childhood, is
Yes,
just let
I
me
understand.
let me take this.
Yeah.
and and finding ways to numb that for many years. And so now how do I learn how to feel that, because I want to feel the full spectrum, right? And I'm numbing at, if I'm numbing in this part of the spectrum, I'm numbing other places too.
Right.
And but also I don't have to unpack every, this is something I'm working on. I don't have to unpack every emotion I have. I can just be like, oh,
Totally.
grief.
Yeah, I think that's part of the, like, sort of what I'm saying, right? Is that it's like, I think we have a tendency in being folks who are sort of consistently trying to be self-aware, trying to be like more alive, trying to be in healthy relationship to the land, to our people, to everything. That yeah, it's hard not to get into a constant place of overanalysis also, and I think also like just over pathologizing or just like maybe I'm just tired. You know, like maybe it's not that like I had a traumatic childhood or, you know, like my relationship with my mother. Maybe I'm just like I need food or I'm tired or something, you know, like
Yes.
And to believe that like, yeah, that sort of idea of passive healing that like I don't, and I guess it's I mean, same thing, right? It's like I don't have to constantly be working. I don't have to constantly like nature heals on its own, you know, like, and I think that balance, right? Like, cause even with Alicia, you talk about like that nature does want to heal, but like nature, like you're saying with a barn, will also take over. So like it also requires a relationship that's like a dance between humans and nature, or like our role within nature, because we're part of nature. That is to steward some of that. So like, where is it that like we apply some of the like stops or starts, I guess, in like a, yeah. And even like you're saying, like the mirror of like us with nature and the environment or whatever, like whatever is happening culturally and whatever's happening in the cosmos and like is also happening within us at the same time, right? That's a lot, I think, of
We're
what
a
we also,
microcosm of the macrocosm.
yeah, that I'm sure that like you and I also geek out about, that I hear Charles talk about all the time. That's, but like it's a type of trauma. Like it's a, like the earth has gone through trauma, we've gone through a type of trauma, and overworking also is sort of like it's a mirror of that trauma in a way that's like I'm healing, but I'm doing it in a way that's like the same sort of trauma loop, I guess.
Yeah, same energy, I think.
Yeah.
It's coming
Yeah.
from that same space. And I think something you said reminded me, I don't know if you follow any of Zach Bush's work, but he
Yeah,
talks a lot
the
about
ion biome stuff. Yeah. Or he has a
yeah,
company.
he does have a company that is a little bit separate to the work that I really love. I really love
Yeah.
Zach Bush, the speaker.
Yeah.
And he talks a lot about this concept of co-creation with nature, right? We're in co-creation, and regenerative agriculture really, I mean, we're in co-creation. Like there's some human hand, and there's this hand of nature, and we're sort of reaching towards one another to find that co-creative space. And I
Yeah.
think that can happen in healing too. Especially, you know, now that I'm curious to see what it would be like to coast for a minute, right? Like not to be hitting the gas on healing, but maybe just to coast for a second and see where
Yeah.
that takes me, to let that passivity wash over me. And there's some question about like what can happen when I just let healing happen. Because I
Yeah.
am always trying, and that's, you know, that's my nature to control, and that's coming like that's coming from all these other spaces. I mean, it's probably my mother, let's be honest.
Yep. Yeah. It's probably my mother also. And also, yeah, I think that's what Western culture, you know, like it's, I mean, permaculture, I think, is helpful to me here too. I was thinking about this the other day, that it's like not just the individual, but it's like the next rung out from you, and the rung beyond that, and the rung beyond that, and all of those are interrelated. But yeah, I think that's where I'm at right now. It's like, and I'm is the like inclination to coast, and it's really difficult. And so I've been talking to Kyle and Lauren some about like purpose stuff, because I realized in the last few weeks that I'm seeing this tendency when I like dial everything down, where I'm like, okay, I'm going to stop working. I'm going to stop creating all the things. I'm going to stop feeling like I have to like produce things also just to like survive, and make this like some sort of sustainable income, right? Um, that I can't stop thinking about it. Like I keep thinking about the things that I want to create. And then when I'm doing it, my system is overwhelmed and it feels like too much. Even if it's just like a little, like I'll engage in something and it all of a sudden feels like work and my system feels overwhelmed. And I was like, oh, that's an attachment issue. I was like, that's like, what's the like disorganized attachment? Like it's like when I'm away from it, I can't stop thinking about it. When I'm in it, I don't want to do it at all. Like, and so I started doing like, I was like, okay, what would be like a healthy way to engage with work that didn't feel like I have to constantly do it, but like, so I started doing just like 2 or 3 hours a day, where I was like, if I can just put in like a little bit every day, and like it doesn't matter what I accomplish, it doesn't matter whatever, but like it just feels like my system is so overtaxed that like I can't approach it. And it feels like the reality is that what I need to do is actually just like let it entirely fall, which is not fun. And probably looks a lot like depression and sort of like emotionally unraveling in a way that's probably my best path to healing, but I'm avoiding like the plague. And so, but it's hard too, because it's like, this is the first thing I've ever done, like the writing and creating this podcast and having these conversations is like the first thing in like a work way I've ever done that felt like I was finally doing purpose work for myself and not for someone else. And it feels really hard to like have found that and now be like, I think I might stop indefinitely. Like, I don't know what the answer is, but it feels like the only thing I know how to do is to like push a full pause and let passive healing happen. And in that passivity, just like allow things to unravel, like, and fully be like, I have to trust that like my body is telling me what I need to do. And that also, yeah, it's like what I preach to other people, right? Is that I like, now is all we have. And I can't like, I think, you know, the tendency or like the thought when you allow things to fall apart, that's like, oh, I'm going to stop making money, or I'm going to stop on a path that will help me make consistent money. I'm going to stop, like, I don't know how to survive. I don't know how I'm going to afford this apartment once like my house money runs out, you know, like all of those things. And just being like, it really doesn't fucking matter. Like I need rest, like a hard rest.
Yeah.
And rest, I think to so many people does feel like seem passive and luxurious. And I'm like, I don't know if you've ever stopped fully, but it's terrible.
It's terrible. I have,
it's so
I have stopped
terrible.
fully multiple times throughout my life. And it is tough. I mean,
Yeah.
it is deep soul searching work to rest.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's where I'm at. Like, I've done everything I can to not be.
When is your cavitation surgery?
So here's what happened there. So I had sort of full but quick journey is that I started in a place that was like, we had to get my mouth in sort of proper working order otherwise before he was willing to start cavitation stuff. And so we started with like fillings and also like reshaping some of my teeth so that my bite actually sort of solidly came down, because apparently my whole life most of my life, I've only been impacting on my molars, which explains a lot about my TMJ issues and all kinds of other structural things. So we did that. And then I'd been starting on a bunch of like also separate from him airway and breathing work. So tongue and mouth and facial exercises.
Yep.
And then I did a tongue tie surgery. So I did a tongue release. And then we knew, like, the biological dentist I've been working with for the cavitation stuff, we knew that.
Are you you're not going to John Osberger in Denver, are you?
I am.
You
yes.
are? Okay.
Yeah.
I've seen John. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Curious to know about your experience there also. But yeah, so he from the beginning had sort of been like, I think we want to heal the deeper stuff with you before we touch removing your cavitations. And for me, that was sleep and thyroid and gut stuff. And to which my sort of internal response was like, sort of like, I've been working on that for 10 years and still have come nowhere close to feeling like those things are solved. It's like asking me to turn the sky orange. I don't know how to accomplish that. But anyway, once I did the tongue tie surgery, I started going to someone named Dr. Turner, who's a dentist more in like the Lakewood-ish area here. And she was fucking incredible. Like the moment I met her, I was like, oh, you're amazing. And so after she did the tongue release surgery on me, I wanted to talk to her about doing like either some sort of Vivos or like palate expansion
of plants. Yeah.
stuff. And so we did an initial consultation where she took photos and like measurements and all kinds of things, which was really fascinating because the first question she asked me when she started actually taking measurements was, do you have a thyroid issue? And I was like, oh my God, you're amazing. How do you know this? And she's like, of course, it's all connected. But so she came back with my results probably about a month ago over Zoom and was like, so turns out that so she took like imaging that sort of went straight down and could see like the sort of size of my throat and all kinds of other things. And apparently the opening in your throat is supposed to be something more like 10 millimeters wide and mine is 4.6. Mm-hmm. And I also, of course, have like really narrow like nasal stuff. And I had 6 teeth removed when I was a child to get my braces on because they're just, because there wasn't enough space, of course. And then obviously later got my wisdom teeth removed because there was increasingly less space. And so I now only have, I think, 24 adult teeth. And so the distance between my teeth is also significantly too small. And so she was like, I don't think you're actually a candidate for an expansion appliance because I think it would make your structural issues and all kinds of other things worse somehow. But what I think you do need is jaw surgery and like top and bottom. And I was like, oh my God, I just don't even know what to do with that. Like, cause that's, I was like spiritually, financially, like I was prepared for cavitation work. Yeah. I was not prepared for something before I even reached cavitation work that looked like not being able to talk, probably a year of like intense healing to actually get back to normal. And also like running, like my work is speaking. Like, what the fuck? Like what am I supposed to do with that? And also the only person she recommends as a jaw surgeon is in Santa Barbara. And so I'm like, oh, that's like living there part-time probably would be required for that. And also like either on the front end or back end having to do braces of some sort to reposition my teeth. And so I was just like, oh, now I'm like fully overwhelmed. Like, and I showed the video to Dr. John and he was like, yep, I actually sadly agree with Dr. Turner. I think you actually probably should do jaw surgery. And I don't want to touch your cavitations until you actually go through all of that deeper healing. And I was like, oh, cool. So now I have no idea when cavitation surgery will happen. It might be as much as 5 years from now. And I've had other people sort of be like, I don't understand. Why can't you just take the infections out now? Because what does it hurt? But Dr. John is like, he's done it before where he's taken infections out before someone was at a deeper level of healing and the infections return. And so he was like, I just don't think that you really want to have to go through this twice. I was like, no, not really. No. So yeah, that's where I'm at. Yeah. Hard pause and being like, well, and also like my daily struggle is like my deepest problem is sleep. It's probably like mild sleep apnea for most of my life. I've, without realizing it, had sleep paralysis since the time I was a child. And it only happens like once or twice a year, but it's quite terrifying when it does. Yes. I've experienced it. Yeah. Yeah. But I think this is also thyroid issues like related, but like for the last 3 weeks, it's been really bad. And I can't sleep past 4:30 in the morning. which then ruins me because I'm not going to get up and eat within 30 minutes to an hour because I'm just not going to cook food that early in the morning. And so my adrenals have to wait from 4 a.m. until like 8 a.m. to actually get food in them. And then my fatigue is really strong. Like it's just a whole like, and she recommended a sleep person to me to like start talking about like intermediate interventions before I go through jaw surgery, like CPAP and some other stuff. But like that person isn't taking new patients until August.
Yes.
It's just a whole like
you get caught in a holding pattern.
Yeah, I'm in a holding pattern, but it's like every single day is like this is so deeply affecting of my ability to even live at all. Like, so yeah, that's my story, or part of it, obviously.
That's tough. That's tough to be. That jaw surgery was recommended to me as a teenager, and I recently went through I'm on a dental adventure, is
Yes,
what I
tell me
keep
more.
calling it. I had some teeth start breaking, and by teeth I mean like all of my molars on my bottom right jaw.
Wow. And
I see a holistic dentist. I saw Dr. John when I lived in Denver, and he recommended cavitation surgery to me. And it didn't align with where I was at the time, either financially or what felt right to me in that moment. And so all these teeth started breaking, and I thought I have kind of like a holistic dentist that is not, he's not nearly where Dr. John is or anything, but he doesn't use mercury and he doesn't use fluoride, which is fine. He's 50 minutes away from me, which is better. I mean, that's the best I'm going to do in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to find a spectacular dentist.
Yes. And so he was like, your teeth are breaking. Are you grinding your teeth? And I was like, no, I can't grind my teeth. I have the worst crossbite ever. I can't even really make these teeth fully touch. So I'm not grinding them. He's like, well, I don't know what you're doing. So I want to make sure that we get you a bite guard, for the teeth grinding that I don't really think you're doing either. I was like, cool, this is not a root cause.
Sure.
I'm going to skip that.
This is a symptom. Yep.
I'm going to skip that. And I went down and I found another biological dentist in New York City. And the width of my bite is something that's bothered me for a while. And after I read James Nestor's book, Breath, I was really interested in having a homeoblock Vivos type expansion appliance and exploring that. And I went down, I looked all over, and I looked at the guy who invented the homeoblock, which is this expansion device, because he's in New York City. Yep. And
I've done some research into him too.
Belfour. But then I found this other dentist, this biological dentist that worked with orificial myology, which it sounds like you've done all the face exercises. And I felt that it had a more holistic, that they were involving more aspects, and went to see him a couple of months ago. And he recommended, that there were several different paths I could take. I could do jaw surgery, but he didn't feel that I needed it. And we're going to try to expand my bite just with Invisalign and with all of these exercises. And then if it needs further expansion at the end, we will address it at that time.
Is the Invisalign, so that's a kind of braces, yeah?
Yeah, it's a kind of braces, but he does it a little bit differently. What I'm interested in and what I want to bring up with you is that as I've been working with my orofacial myologist, her name is Paula, and she's an old New York Italian and like everything that implies. She's fantastic. And progesterone has a really big role in what keeps the rigidity of that airway. And so I just want to say that I keep every podcast of yours I listen to, that just kept coming up for me. Also because my own healing journey has been so much about healing my progesterone specifically.
Yeah, I've been following this practitioner online. What's his name? I'm forgetting, but it's called Forefront Health, and he talks about hypothyroid stuff all the time. and talks about the role of progesterone also in healing your thyroid. And that's been one of those things where I'm like, I haven't quite yet found a practitioner that I feel like can guide. Like, I don't know where to go to even, like, I don't feel like fucking with hormones on my own
Okay.
necessarily, unless I get some sort of guidance.
Yeah.
Because it's just something I don't know anything about. So yeah, I don't know. That's sort of my first response is like, that sounds great. And it also like rings true with some stuff that I've been finding, but I don't quite know how to proceed with it. But I'm with you. I think that like that's been sort of my other internal sense is that like maybe cavitations and stuff are part of a root cause, or like the jaw stuff, obviously, but it's so invasive or like it's just a lot. That's a lot. And I'm like, is that really necessary in order to like get a deeper healing, you know? Because it really, yeah, that level of work is so huge.
Yeah. It's
That,
introducing new trauma too.
yeah,
And I think there's a balance there, right? Like, I think that
right.
that can be great. And sometimes we need to go through that. And I think that there are always going to be multiple paths.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think I respect that's why Dr. John feels like getting at a deeper level of healing is sort of necessary before doing cavitation removal, just because I think that like, I'm assuming that part of what he understands is that like too much trauma at once is just like too much for your body. So like, if you're not actually at a deeper place of healing, it's like overtaxing your system in order to remove those. But yeah, I think that like my internal, like my body, I feel like just started to be like, how about you just rest and also trust that like your body can passively heal. And yeah, that like maybe there are other ways to get at that. Maybe they're slower, they probably look different, but yeah, I don't know. Same thing where it's like sometimes those things are necessary, but also it was like, yeah, it was a trauma to sell my house. It was a like it's a lot to like give that much financially. It's a lot to put my life and everything on pause to go through something like jaw surgery. And that's, yeah, it's just so significant. And I'm like, I understand that like generationally we've done things that have got us here. Like I know why my mouth is too small.
Yes.
But also if our nature is to heal, like I don't know that I'm bad. Like I don't think my mouth is bad. I think it's fine, and I think I'm just starting to lean toward I don't know. Yeah, maybe later. I'm not really making like being super clear, but like I
That's
just
okay.
like yeah, maybe
You don't
later
need to be
we'll
clear.
yeah, thank
That's
you.
okay. Not
Uh
everything has to be clear.
yes, so true. Uh but yeah, maybe it will come later for me. But
Can
for now, it just feels like stopping is my answer.
can I pry? Can I ask you a couple of questions
Of
to
course.
fulfill my curiosity because
Yeah.
I can't stop thinking about this? Are your sleep issues cyclical?
How do you mean that?
Do you have the same sleep issues every night or do they change throughout the month?
Um, I've never done a very good job of tracking that. I'm trying to think if anything like comes to mind.
Yeah.
No, I don't
Just
think I've done a very good job at it.
okay.
That's also a bad way to put it. But like I've just
No,
never put a lot of effort into tracking that.
yeah. That's fair. I'm just curious if it's the same every night. I mean, maybe there are sleep issues, but is it the same is it this waking up at 4:30
No,
every
yeah, I mean that's not consistent. Like I feel like the pattern for me is more like once my body wakes up at a certain time on any individual night, it's like all of a sudden it thinks that's the new waking hour. And so it doesn't necessarily matter when I go to sleep. Like I've tried to be like, okay, maybe I could break the pattern if I don't go to bed until midnight or 1,
mm-hmm.
just so like my body pushes through
Mm-hmm.
that like time period. So maybe I'll sleep for a full 6 hours. But like regardless, I'll go to sleep late and I'll still wake up between 4 and 4:30. And I also, to be quite honest, I'm not totally sure if it's in conjunction with my cat. Like, I think maybe I start wrestling, like tossing and turning, and then he starts waking up, and then all of a sudden he might think it's time to, like,
Mhm.
so there's a lot of other things going on there too, I think. But yeah, it's like once I get into a pattern, I can't seem to break it. So there are a couple things going on. Like sometimes that happens. It's been really bad for the last 3 weeks almost. I haven't been able to break the pattern. And now I've been starting to try to do like, um, last night I bought some CBD, CBN stuff, like a
Mhm.
one-to-one to try to like start ramping that up and hopefully getting me to push through that. Um, but like, yeah, I don't know. I definitely go through periods where this is true.
Okay.
And it doesn't necessarily seem related to, I don't find it's super related to my period because it's sort of been before, after, during,
Mhm.
and yeah, also not stress necessarily. Like I'm not,
Yeah.
I mean, despite the last however long we've been on this call, it sounds like I've been in a lot of stress. Like I actually physically don't feel
Yeah.
like I'm not in constant like
I understand that.
anxiety or stress. Um, so yeah, I don't know what this is, but yeah, it's like that's why I think I sort of feel like hormonal thyroid
Yeah.
stuff, like something is just like waking
Yeah.
me up. But I also have a secondary thing that's more like when I am sleeping, like the sleep testing that we've done on me so far, which has been really small in scale, but like apparently I've just like not gotten deep sleep for my entire life for like
Yeah.
very much
That's
of
not
it.
good.
So yeah, and I also just did, I had someone tell me about this, which is again one of those like, I'm just going to try it because I'm
Mhm.
curious. But it was like a lab and stool test thing from a company called Viome that came back and was like, yeah, your oxidative stress is pretty bad. And one of those things might be because you're not actually getting a lot of oxygen. I'm like, yeah, I can barely breathe.
Yeah. Yeah.
uh,
I
so
mean,
yeah,
have you read Breath by James Nestor?
no, I've heard of it though. Yeah,
M-
I'm doing all the dental stuff. I've heard of it.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
And that's obviously a vitally important function, breathing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I've listened to a lot of the like Chris Kresser stuff and his guests that also talk about like Alzheimer's and stuff. My grandmother had Alzheimer's, and from what I understand, tends to skip a generation down the same line that it's in. So your
Hmm.
matrilineal line, if it was your grandmother. So technically, I would be, if that's true. I don't know if that's true or not, but if that is true, that I would be sort of lined up well for that. But like the Chris Kresser guests who talk about dental health often talk about like what we're finding around lack of oxygen, especially
Mhm.
when you sleep,
Mhm.
and how that is like super. Yeah, we're finding that it leads to things like
Mhm.
Alzheimer's. And
You're not
so,
you're not cleaning your brain at night. You don't have access to
yeah,
that glymphatic system
yeah,
that's flushing cerebrospinal fluid through your brain and
right.
breaking up beta amyloid plaques.
Whoa, way to bring out the big guns.
Yeah, but that is part of why we sleep and why
Yeah,
we require sleep to sort of clean out our brain. And it also, I mean, it also sets memories and
yeah. Yeah, and I'm sure even leads to things like I've said for a long time, I know I dream, but I don't really remember my dreams.
I don't either relate to
And
that.
um, yeah, it's hard. I mean, given my airway issues, like I'm like my throat and nose and everything else have not been actually taking in good air for my
Mhm.
entire life. Like I've actually just never been well slept.
Have you tried like really basic breathe right strips to like open things up a
Mm,
little bit and mouth taping, which works for some people. It depends on how bad your sinus airway issues are to begin with,
mm,
just your sinus passages. But sometimes can be an interesting just test to do,
yeah.
to see if you can force some of that nasal breathing, which is going to begin to open up sinuses. Like it's going to create a feedback loop where your sinuses are beginning to
Mm,
have a little bit more space because you're getting nitric oxide. And part of breathing through our noses, you probably know this, but is to create nitric oxide, which is going to help with vasodilation. It's going to help with sleep. It's going to help with hormone production. It's going to help with
mm,
all of these things.
mm,
And so sometimes I like to start at let's just start at like the easiest, dumbest thing I can do at home as an N of
Totally.
one experiment. And I think either breathe right strips, or you can get nasal, they're like nasal dilators. They're these really
Mm-hmm.
sexy things you shove in your nose to make, and it like expands it.
Yeah.
And then you use paper tape, like a paper medical tape, to tape your mouth shut at night to see if you can get some of that nasal breathing and how that might adjust it
Mm-hmm.
just in a couple of days, if that's possible. And
Yeah.
this is like, I love self experimentation and exploring this to try to figure out if I can, if I can get some relief, if I can move the dial a little bit myself
Yeah.
before I'm outsourcing to professionals. But that has been I healed all of my own hormone stuff. I did all of, I've done a lot of my
Yeah,
own
I'm curious to hear about your
medicaling.
the thyroid stuff for you. Or even you said your husband also has goiters.
My husband has multinodular goiter, and he has three rather large. I mean, you can see his thyroid too. Like
Mm.
when he does this, you can really see his thyroid. And we keep a really close eye on it. And we've shrunk them a little bit through lifestyle, and his TSH level stays pretty even. So I don't want to touch it.
Mm.
I don't want to put him on something like Synthroid. I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
remove his thyroid if we don't have to unnecessarily, but he does have some airway issues because of it, and some,
Mm.
because that's pressing
Mm.
on his airway. He has some sleep related breathing issues that are pretty small, but we have to work to keep them small.
Mm.
My thyroid, when I initially really got into this health journey about, I don't even know anymore, 7 years ago, eight
Mm-hmm.
years ago, I had come off of some really bad choices working in the industry. I was drinking too much, I was doing drugs, and I had really lost my way. Western Daughters was constantly on the brink of closing,
Mm.
and that weighed heavy on me, and I wanted to run away from it. And I did. And then I woke up one day and was like, oh, it all has to stop. I stopped everything cold turkey. Everything had to go, and I had to get healthy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and after a tough childhood and vegetarianism forever and
Mm-hmm.
all of these.
Sounds right. It's tracking. Yep, I
Yep,
get it.
yep. And then all of the stress that I had put on my own body, things had broken down pretty far. And I remember when I got my first full set of labs with a functional medicine doctor that I was working with in Denver, my thyroid levels, I think, were just under 6. I think my TSH was around 5.6, putting me pretty squarely in, subclinical hypothyroid. So
Mm.
maybe Western medicine wouldn't categorize it as hypothyroid, but it definitely is. Most
Mm-hmm.
people ideally function under, I would say, under 2.5 TSH is kind of that threshold. And I know that I function better well under 2. I'm currently sitting at about 1.5, and I feel great.
Mm.
And I worked with a functional medical doctor for a while, and then kind of went off on my own. And I was like, I need to understand this better, which
Mm-hmm.
is always I always ask why. I'm the little kid that is still, but why? Why?
Yeah.
Well, why that? Why that? And
Mm-hmm.
that desire for me to get to the root of anything has always been really present. And
Yeah.
so I wanted to know for myself. And so I went and I became a nutrition therapist. So I went to the Nutrition Therapy Institute, and I did 2 years of school and to learn all of these different things about how nutrition impacted us. And in the interim, I mean, just read tons of books, and spent a lot of time on PubMed and doing my own research, and listened to podcasts and sought out voices in this space which have
Mm-hmm.
evolved over time,
Mm-hmm.
and worked on things. and worked on my thyroid specifically for a while. I'd kind of go through phases. Like I worked on my hormones first. I did a Dutch test, which I think is an excellent marker if you like seeing lab values.
Mm.
And I think it's great because it also does a 24-hour, so you pee on these pieces of paper and it's a dried urine test. And it does a 24-hour picture of cortisol, which I kind
Mm.
of think is a really great place to start because
Mm-hmm.
cortisol is going to be a space where, first of all, if we're making too much cortisol, then it's stealing from pregnenolone, which is sort of our master hormone that can turn into cortisol or progesterone or estrogen. And if you're converting all of that to cortisol, then you don't have anything left over for all of your sex hormones that you need to regulate your cycle and your body.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have too little of it, that presents its own issues too, and often plays deeply into our sleep wake cycle because cortisol gets a bad rap for being a stress hormone, but it's really what wakes us up in the morning.
Yeah. Yeah,
Is
I feel that like because I know that's sort of what happens in our bodies that like when I wake up between 4 and 4:30, I'm like, please fall asleep before you feel the hit of cortisol. Like, but because
Yeah, I can feel
once
it
that's
too.
happened, I'm like, we're done
It's
here.
done.
We're
It's
awake.
toast.
Yeah.
Um, and healing that started a lot with my relationship with light and really
Mm-hmm.
changing my relationship with both natural light and the lights that we were using in our house, the lights that are
Yeah.
coming out of
You have probably
devices.
affected my light practices more than anyone I know.
I think
For
I
sure.
think light can I think it's incredible how much light can fix.
Yeah. I don't know that you saw it, but your stories over the weekend about walking in particular, like and how that was affecting your cycle, and PMS and all of those other
Mm-hmm.
symptoms. Like and also in conjunction with light was I mean the light is not surprising to me, but the like walking also was like, whoa. That's so incredible.
Yeah,
But yeah, it's yeah, seems like a pretty big deal.
it is. Walking has been my biggest healer in all of this. I don't do a lot of high intensity exercise because
Yeah,
that's
same.
again gonna
Yeah,
hurt that
cortisol and
delicate
adrenals.
delicate
Yeah.
balance.
Yeah,
Um,
I
but
understand.
I get morning light, within 15 minutes of waking up, I am outside, even if it is negative 10 degrees outside,
Wow. Yeah,
to
I'm not quite there yet, but I'm working on
recalibrate
it.
that. Yeah. And it takes time. But
Yeah.
you have this master, your suprachiasmatic nucleus is where light comes into your brain, and your eyeballs are really just extension of your brain.
Right.
And I
Right.
really love this.
It's the only external part of our brain, right? Is it
Yeah,
the
Huberman
Yeah.
talks about this a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so getting that light, but I think sunrise is even better because there are wavelengths of light in sunrise that are healing. You can get some of that infrared
Mm.
light that actually penetrates up to 30 centimeters deep inside of tissues.
I have a really technical question around that.
Yeah.
My apartment, my bedroom is on the eastern side.
Mm-hmm.
I have these really gorgeous, beautiful, huge windows that let in light at sunrise. But the only place I can sort of be outside and like I have a patio on the western side, a balcony.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm out at sunrise, even on the western side, not looking straight into the sunrise, like, am I still getting those?
Yeah. And so the most important thing, first of all, yes, you are getting some of the infrared.
Yeah.
But what you're really getting is you're getting the amount of lux, which is the brightness of the light that we
Uh-huh.
cannot get through a window.
Right.
And that is setting things. It's an interesting question on the infrared. You would at sunset, for
Yeah,
sure.
well, yeah, for sure. Like I know I'm getting sunset, but I'm concerned that like if I don't actually walk down 3 flights of stairs and out to the other side to
Mm-hmm.
see
Mm-hmm.
sunrise,
Mm-hmm.
or even actually beyond that, because of course I've got like there are buildings on the other side, so I'd
Mm-hmm.
have to like really walk somewhere else in order to actually
Mm-hmm.
be in a sunrise vantage point, which especially in the winter is
Mm-hmm.
just really going to be a challenge for me.
I think the light in your eyes is going to be more important than the infrared.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah, if I mean, I'm assuming if I get infrared throughout the rest of the day, because I mean, I've been trying to go on morning walks, probably within, I'd say no more than 2 hours. Well, if I'm waking up at 4 in the morning, this is a whole other story.
Yes.
But like in a
Yes.
normal world, if I wake up at like 6 a.m., I try and be out there by no later than like 7:30ish, or 8
Then you're
even.
getting
But like
an infrared.
it's before 30 degrees in the
Yeah.
air,
Then you're
is my
getting
goal.
infrared.
Yeah. And then I try, you've been especially affecting, I think, of my solar noon habits. So getting out on the balcony at solar noon also,
Yeah.
and exposing as much skin as possible and all of that sort of stuff.
And
So
vitamin D, which
yeah,
I think is severely underestimated in all of this
yeah.
as an
Well, also another
endogenous
hormone.
hormone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not really a vitamin.
Yeah. Not really a vitamin at all.
Yeah, I'm really sad because I think we talked so much on DM the other day on Instagram that I can't go back and access your thoughts on vitamin A and vitamin D. They're like buried beyond where we can go back to, I
I
think.
can pull them back up. I think those are all good things, but I think healing hormones did a lot for me. And
Yeah.
my progesterone is always an uphill battle. It's very hard for me to keep it
Hmm.
steady. And I haven't been able to get off of a supplement for it.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, if you take something for
I
that
do.
or if you get it through something else.
I take something. I think that, we can make space in other places, right? Like with pregnenolone for our body to endogenously produce progesterone, but sometimes we can't make that space, right? Because there's too
Hmm.
many other things that need healing. And so I
Right.
think that there's something to be said for giving it a little poke,
A little nudge.
a
Yeah.
little nudge. Um,
Um, yeah, it's funny. I mean, you're talking about like being sort of infinitely curious and sort of going off on your own path. Like Lauren and I joke about this all the time because she tends to be the person that like if you pose a certain healing modality to her or some sort of supplement or whatever, like she will, it's a problem because she will go down a rabbit hole that's so deep it's hard to get out of.
mhm.
And I like to believe in things metaphorically, meaning like at an intuitive level.
Yeah.
It's like, this makes sense. That sounds right. And also to have people I trust, like Lauren or like some other practitioners I
Yeah.
found, just be like, I've done the research. If I jive with you, like, go ahead and do it, Brandy, because like you, I mean, I've done this. This has been a 10+ year journey,
Yeah.
and like of actually digging into it.
Mhm.
When I became, when did I start eating vegetarian? How old was I? I don't know. It was somewhere in my maybe mid to late 20s, I think. And I ate mostly vegan at home. So I was vegetarian, but I ate cheese and stuff only when I went out. And about 2 or 3 years into that, I started getting sick. Like my chronic illness really started becoming very apparent. And I, of course, did all the things to try and figure out what that was. Actually, at one point, I developed a cough that lasted for 2 years also, that was life altering. I still think it was whooping cough, but somewhere in the middle because no one would diagnose it correctly. I was trying to self-heal, and I'd been watching all the like vegetarian documentaries about like juicing and all kinds of things. So I started, like I was eating a lot of raw foods and salads. Like I was paying a lot of attention to like, what's her name? Chris. She's the like, she had cancer and she started eating vegetarian and now is like, I don't know, she has a whole like health and content company around it. So I was paying a lot of attention to that. So I was eating like a lot of raw salads and drinking raw orange juice and eating raw garlic to try and heal, like to homeopathically heal this cough that I had because they're antimicrobial or whatever. And without knowing it, gave myself, I think, the most severe case of acid reflux someone can experience. And so the first cough stopped being the same. Like the first cough was sort of rib cracking and then all of a sudden like an unproductive. And then I gave myself a second cough in the middle of it that became productive and just I couldn't wake up without coughing things up. But like it was so bad. Like I couldn't go to the movies because I'd just cough through the movie. I stopped wanting to do anything social because everywhere I went, people would be like, how are you? And I'd have to catch them up on where I was at. I had a friend who used to work in the same building as me who at some point told me that she knew that she always knew if I was coming because she could hear me coughing.
Oh.
Yeah, it was really bad. I joke too. I crushed like the entire season of Friday Night Lights and The West Wing in a very like 6 months probably because I was just staying at home. Like I couldn't
Mhm.
go anywhere and do anything social. And yeah, that was in 2013, maybe into 2014. And then I went through the biggest breakup I've ever been through, and that wrecked me in other ways. And yeah, it's just been sort of constant since then. But yeah, it's been a really long journey. And at this point, I'm like, I spend so much of my time looking into health things that like I just don't have the capacity to be like, let me dig in on progesterone. like, so
Yeah.
I just, yeah, Lauren the other day, like yesterday even, I was like, oh, I did this lab and stool sample test. And, you know, she was like, that was probably trash. And I'm like, it's probably true, but like, I don't know. I can't always do the amount of work necessary to like really understand every sort of aspect like that. And I'm like, it's as much as I can do to be like, well, my sunlight and vitamin D, you know, like beef liver and my food and fermentation and oh my god, fermentation might be bad for you because it has histamines, you know, like it's just it's so constant that I try and allow other people to be nerdy if they want to be nerdy.
Yeah. Low histamine diet changed my life when I needed it. We can talk about histamines. But we can talk about mold. We can talk about healing mold out of your
Yeah.
body. Um, done all of that. Uh, yes,
Yeah.
it's a lot. And I
Yeah, I mean, I
think
think
we're
most of us who have done
missing
this
our
run across all
healers.
those things because they're everywhere. Mold
Yeah.
and
And I
yeah.
think, yeah. And I think we're sensitive. You know, I often equate this to being a canary in the coal mine. And I
Yeah.
have a really
Yeah.
delicate system, and it's more easily thrown off than other people's
Yeah.
systems. And so
Which again is a
I'm
gift.
more
I think it's our gift
sensitive.
to offer.
More sensitive. Yes, I do too. I do too. And I think that what I want to see in the next paradigm shift of this world is to have healers that can be trusted so that we aren't responsible for all of the research all of the
Yeah.
time, that we don't have to understand every little facet of these systems, and that there are trusted resources out there, because some people I think are meant to go through this in order to become healers,
Yeah.
but other
The
people
wounded
just
healer
need to be
archetype.
healed.
Totally.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some
And
people
I mean,
just need to be healed.
yeah, I mean, I feel like that's part of my journey. Like, I think it's why I have things to say. You know, like, I think having gone through all of this, like, I have strong opinions and I think a gift, like, I think I'm sure we both have a gift to offer the world in that regard because we have had to go through so much of this as people who are sort of highly sensitive to this sort of thing. I heard a story at one point. I tell Lauren all the time that we use as a scenario or like a metaphor other than canary in the coal mine is like farmers apparently, I guess, I don't know, used to, maybe still do, like put rose bushes on the end of crops because rose bushes tend to be more sensitive. And that way they could tell if like pests were coming or some other, you know,
Sure.
virus was on its way that like the roses would tell you first.
Yeah.
So we sort of
Interesting.
refer to ourselves as rose bushes.
Yeah.
Sort of that like outer layer of protection against society to be like, hey guys, something is off. Um, which I think again is that like sort of wounded healer
Mm-hmm.
situation that's like, for whatever reason, and I'm sure it has to do with childhood trauma and all kinds of other things, but like that, yeah, we're just sensitive little creatures, but you
I
know,
think it's also evolutionary biology.
mm,
And this is something that I think is beautiful. You're going to see about, estimates put it between 10 and 20% of the population. So let's call it 15% of the population that is going to be more sensitive in order to serve that purpose within a community in an evolutionary sense. You
mm-hmm,
know, if you have a little bit of a berry and
mm-hmm,
it's disastrous and you're really sensitive to it, you can go back to the group and say, hey, this berry isn't a good idea.
yeah,
Just to
yeah,
really oversimplify it. And so I think that it's not just an archetype, but it is part of being a community. And I mean, I'm grateful for this aspect of myself now. It's taken work to get there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the early part, I'm sure you resonate with this, is just, yeah, feeling like you're just broken, like something about you is wrong.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Oh, and we're told that. I mean, I was
yeah,
told that repeatedly. I spent a lot of time in psychiatrists and psychopharmacologists offices as a child and was told that I was broken and
yikes.
I would never be off of medication, that I was doomed, that I was genetically fucked, I think is how somebody at one point put it.
Oh my God, Kate. Cool, 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 cool.
And was, yeah, and had been on, I had been on 10 different antidepressants before I was 16. And I mean, there's no better way to tell a child that they are irreparably broken. And during that entire time, not one person asked what was going on at home.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you feel broken because you're told by medical professionals that there's something that's broken and that they don't even understand what's like. Obviously, something must be broken because you feel this way.
Yeah.
But maybe something is just perfectly right with you.
Right.
That,
Maybe your body's doing exactly what it was built to do.
yeah.
Just tell you that something is off.
Yeah. And maybe you're
Yeah.
serving a purpose within society exactly like you're supposed to tell society that we're living in toxic soup.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's, I think probably one of my most powerful newsletters I've ever written. It's called A Sick Society Plus an Individual Burden. Basically about how we are living in a toxic soup, and that the burden of that is so often on the individual because we live in such an individualistic society. So it's like sort of written through the lens of telling my story about going on the GAPS diet and like it was my job to make all the broth. It was my job to do the detox baths. It was my job to do the shopping. I was the only one cooking. I was living alone in the midst of the beginning of the pandemic in May 2020, which also happened to be when like Colorado wildfires were rampant and George Floyd had just been murdered and like the world was on fire and my body was on fire. Like the whole thing was on fire and just going, it was all on me. Like I was the only one there to take care of it. And the amount of work that I've individually had to do, like we've been talking about, to understand the lead that's in our water and the nutrients that are lacking in our soil and what filters I should be using on my shower and what meat I should be eating. And like, like the amount of, it's just a mountain of work. And again, interesting that I call it work. But there's a part sort of toward the end where I'm like, I think even going back to the beginning of, this conversation, I was like, our too muchness, that we seem like too much to a lot of people. And I think why I've turned a corner on that for a long time, I think, but like that I have started to see that as our gift to the world because, I think the experience of being someone who sort of has a higher sensitivity than other people and is often experiencing more physical illness because of that. That either there's a lot of gaslighting that we experience where it's like, wow, you're just making a really big deal out of something that's like not really that big of a deal. Or like, sure, maybe it's bad in society, but like, it's not really that big of a deal. Like, calm down, like just go to work, do your job, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the lines I say is something to the effect of like, if you have not experienced these symptoms yet, trust me when I say that you will one day. Like if you don't turn now, like it's doing the rosebush thing where it's like, I know that I'm the first one, but like, don't think that I'm just broken. Like this is me being like, hey guys, the berry is bad. Even if your symptoms aren't loud enough yet, like one day they will be. And like, I'm begging you to please pay attention to them now before it's like too catastrophic. So yeah, I think it serves a purpose in a collective for sure.
I do too. And I do think, I mean, I think we're seeing that. We're seeing the massive rise in autoimmunity and diabetes, in infertility, in all of these different spaces that I think are reflective of what our environment is going through. Like I think about the fertility of soil, right? We've lost so much topsoil and so many nutrients, and we're experiencing this infertility, and it's being reflected again in all of these different, there are all of these other mirrors where that is being reflected. And we're one of those mirrors.
Yeah.
But I also think that there's an aspect of like we can choose to see that, to recognize it, and we can also choose to see the resiliency that nature has to offer us and how it wants to build topsoil, how bare earth wants to cover itself, that there is resiliency within that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Here's the thing I'm afraid to talk about.
Please start with that. Okay, go for it.
Yeah, the fertility thing. I don't know if we're publishing this, but I'm just going to tell it to you how I would tell it to you if we weren't, and hope that if we do end up publishing it, I'm brave enough to do that. Yeah, I feel like a few years ago, I started seeing like all of my friends. So, of course, because, hold on, eating this banana. Because I was a vegetarian and I was friends with a bunch of vegetarians and vegans. It becomes an identity.
Yes.
So like a lot of people around me were vegetarians and vegans. God love them. I love them. They're incredible.
Absolutely.
But we were getting old enough where we were starting to, like, people around me were starting to have children. Or let me rephrase that. People around me were starting to try to have children.
Yep.
And miscarriage after miscarriage, and IVF round after IVF round. And at some point, I started to sort of be like, this doesn't feel normal. And I've heard you say this before, and Lauren and I use this phrase all the time. Common, not normal.
Not normal.
Like also, just like, it's wild to me, the amount, I mean, I guess this is sort of like vaccines, right? And big pharma, where it's like, this seems interesting and really profitable to have people be so infertile that we have to constantly be looking to IVF in order to have children. But also, like, what does it say about our bodies that like they're clearly not ready to birth a child? Like, and they're not.
Fertility is our biggest indicator of health in a regard, right? Like that is the body saying, I feel safe enough to be a haven for something else, to make life.
It's a really beautiful, that just made me realize too, like in my conversation with Andreas Weber, like his sort of metaphor in that, or like his phrase was like fecundity, like fecundity. Fertility, like that, like life wants more life. Like, so fertility, of course, is like human capacity to give more life to the world. And if we can't do that, it must be saying something about how alive we are.
Yes.
Like,
Oh, I think that's beautiful. And it's declining precipitously. I mean, we've seen sperm counts decline by over 50% since 1960. 1 in 3 women will have troubles staying pregnant. And, you know, I think we've all, if you're of a certain age, you've seen this with your friends, or, you know, with yourself.
Yeah. And I think, you know, something that Charles talks about, and I think I've heard you mention even, like that we're living in this way, like it's, Charles talks about, I guess, with work and coffee as an example of a stimulant, that like and fossil fuels also is that mirror, that we're having to like, we're using exogenous, like extractive methods in order to pull energy out of places that are depleted in energy. And I started to see IVF as one of those things where it's like, I just didn't feel like it could be very good for us if our bodies were telling us like, hey, we're not actually at a level of health that's able to carry a child. So then we look for outside stimulus in order to inject that ability into us through IVF. And then we start birthing another generation of children who are like their gut health is at a depleted level. And so they're already starting at a biologically disadvantage, like,
Yeah,
you know,
at
a
a
disadvantage. At a deficit, and then they're having to work their way to health at an even deeper level of having to dig themselves out of, and then they have less opportunity, like less health to be able to birth children, and then they're injecting even more into it. So we're just like biologically fucking ourselves, I think, by
Yes.
forcing our bodies to have children when we're not actually at a level of health to have children, which of course is part of why I'm scared to say that out loud, because it is real to have like your closest friends be like, I deeply want children, and to be like, I don't think you should. Like, that's not,
Yeah.
it's just like, I mean, I'm never going to say that to a friend, but like, it's still, it's also really hard, like, because my friends, I can't say that out loud to a lot of people because it gets heard as, I think often in my experience, it gets heard as victim blaming, where it's like, you've not eaten correctly, you've not done something, so you're at fault for the fact that you can't have a child and you're a terrible person is like, I think how it gets translated. And so all of my friends who aren't meat eaters, and I'm not going to say meat is the only solution to all of those things, but like
It's part of it.
it's a
I
huge part
truly
of
believe
it.
it's part of it.
It's a huge part of it. But like, again, we live in a toxic soup. So there's
do.
all kinds of things beyond just our connection to meat and death and life and like all of these things that would lead us here. But I of course never mean it in a victim blaming scenario. It's just like, we have to realize at some point that, like, I say this in my Why I Talk About Purpose in terms of vaccines, where it's like,
I listened to that.
something must be off if like our bodies can't cope with a virus to this degree. Sort of.
Yeah.
Tell me. You're shaking your head, so tell me.
Well, I agree with you on infertility, but and I do think, you know, this is a conversation that I also do not have with my friends that are unsuccessfully trying to conceive, because there is that aspect of them wanting to take it on as well. It's my fault that I didn't do these things. But really, this is a societal issue, and it speaks to something much greater, that we are not taking care of the next generation and the next generation before it's born, right? That we have lost this idea of a long-term vision for human health in order for short-term profits, whether you're a pharmaceutical company, or short-term gains if you're somebody looking to put a band-aid on a bullet hole that isn't going to fix anything, right? Or to rush your body into something chemically,
Yeah.
because your body isn't doing that, but which is tough. And I think that all of this speaks to, like, we have lost the community that is holding both people that are looking to become parents and to support, you know, that aspect of it takes a village. I think we've lost that in a lot of different places. And we're not providing an alternative. We're just saying, well, there's this set of things, you know, you go to the doctor and you seek the IVF treatment instead of looking for that root cause, right? And in terms of the virus, yes, I think that this is something that affected society more than it should have. And I think that there are really key metrics to look at in terms of who it affected more. That, you know, 88% of all ICU people that had COVID in the ICU had at least,
who wound up in an ICU.
Yeah, had at least 4 comorbidities. That's a lot. And at the same time, how did we as a society, and this is really controversial, deal with a virus that was 99.98% survivable by completely shutting down our aspect of community? And so, yes, this virus hit harder than it should have, and was really showing us maybe, like, here are our weak spots. And when you look at those comorbidities, metabolic health, huge weak spot. Less than 12% of Americans are categorized as metabolically healthy. Well, that's not good.
Right. I guess
Um,
that's what I mean, though, is that, like, I mean, all the comorbidities exist because of this larger picture of health or lack of health
yes.
in society. And so it's not just the virus, it's like, what is it that has put us into a state of not, like, that many people
Yes.
not being able to survive a virus that should have been largely survivable by most
Yes.
people. And it strikes me, too, as you were saying that, like, just the part about, like, not having community to hold folks who are trying to birth children but can't seem to, that, like, yeah, I had a moment where, when you were saying that, I was like imagining having that conversation with a friend, and like the what do I do then? Like, just a, and also really hard because, of course, like, a lot of these people I know have been working on health for a really long time. So it's not like they haven't been looking at the root cause, like, they've been trying to find a root cause. And for them, sometimes that was deciding to be vegetarian, that's where they were at. And I've obviously wound up somewhere different, but, like, these are not people who are just like, I don't know, like, I'm doing whatever and I don't care, but, like, at the same time, even when they reach that place, like, the real human moment of, like, a response, it's like, then do I just not have children?
Yeah.
And just realizing, as you were saying that, I mean, that goes back to death, which is like, we are so, and it also goes back to the beginning of this conversation. Like, we are so resistant to letting things fall apart and to facing the real grief that is necessary to actually heal, I think. Because that's a lot of grief. Like,
Yes.
a generation of people who cannot birth children, and when they do, are birthing children who are unhealthy. And by that, I mean, like, so many children have a lot of, like, existing disease by the time they're born.
This generation the statistics do not look good.
Yeah. And so it's like, well, instead of just trying to erase it and fix it and move beyond it and just stop, forget that the problem exists. Let's actually have a real moment of grief. Like, that's, like, maybe you can't have children, and maybe we shouldn't. If it is just going, like, if it is ignoring a long-term picture of human health.
I agree.
And that's pretty fucking devastating. And not even as someone who, I don't necessarily even want to have children, but, like, even thinking about my friends who were there, like, that's really hard.
I mean, it's something we're thinking about. My husband we would have had kids years ago if my husband had his way. But and by that I mean he's given me all the grace in the world to make a decision and is in it for the long haul. But I was thinking about, as you said that, and I hope this isn't too crass, but as farmers, you consider the health of the animals that you're breeding. You don't want to pass down the line ill health. That's not what you want to do. And I think that there's this moment of grief that we would have to go through, and grief is the hardest one, right? And I also think it's the emotion that usually belies a lot of other emotions. I know that under my anger is often grief, that under my avoidance is often grief. There's something about that being an almost, mother emotion, right? It's this emotion that all of these other emotions spring from. But I think there's also this aspect, if we were in a village, that we would be raising children as a village, that there would be connection to children,
Right.
yours or not. And a sense of participating in bringing up the next generation. And so there's a disconnect there, where we're raising children alone on little islands without, parents don't have support, and we also have people that want that connection.
Yeah.
to children. Yeah.
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 I'm just saying, I mean, always comes back to this, which is what Charles says all the time. Like we're living in a story of separation. And that, like, to me, is sort of the root of our illness. Like we are sick because we are separated. And I've talked about this before, and maybe it was in that why I talk about purpose, but yeah, like sin, the definition of sin is separation, basically. Like, yeah. And so it says something to me that, yeah, it's like, I know you talk about also like disconnection from animals and meat, and that as a healing modality that you've chosen. But I like even just the like collective piece of, you say in your opening episode, it was so close to what Charles says. He has an article called The Coronation.
I've read it.
I'm sure you've read, where he says, how much life are we willing to sacrifice at the altar of security? Mm-hmm. Yeah. What life are we willing to sacrifice in avoidance of death is what you say. I can't remember if that's in your opening episode or the one with Alicia, but, yeah. And it's like, I follow a guy named Rob Bell a lot, have for most of my life. And, he's a former pastor. He used to run this massive church in, Michigan, and then got, basically excommunicated from the church from evangelicalism, because, he started sounding a little bit too much like a universalist. And, there's a whole other story to that, but regardless, I still listen to his podcast, and there's one recently where he was talking about like, and I thought this was so striking for me, like personally and also collectively, something about how if you've lost your ability to imagine, like if your imagination feels inaccessible, perhaps you haven't grieved properly, meaning that like there's some sort of connection between our ability to imagine new solutions and our refusal to, or ability to actually properly grieve. And I was like, ooh, that one like hit me in the stomach, because I was like, all these things that I feel like I have a hard time imagining, like what would a future look like if, or like, what would my friends do if they couldn't have children, or how would we support them collectively? Which feels, hard to imagine, especially at scale. And especially being so mired in a story of separation these days. Like it takes an awful lot of work, and it's part of why I moved my whole life here. Like part of moving was not just wanting to pay for dental cavitation. I moved to Boulder specifically because it was me in closer intimacy and community with people who were willing to be at that and interested in and engaging in that level of intimacy that I hadn't found anywhere else. And so I lost my train of thought there, but basically that, like, all these things that I feel like I haven't been able to imagine well. I haven't dated seriously in a really long time also, and it, like, at a certain point that becomes really difficult to imagine. And just like, yeah, again, even the beginning of this conversation, me talking about just feeling like my body keeps telling me stop, like just stop. And as much as it's hard to stop and not keep thinking about the thing I want to be doing, that like the real healing is actually grief, like grief and all of the like mountain of unmet needs that not only me, but I think collectively we've actually not had access to. Close community, intimacy, community who's around us, supporting us in all these ways. Part of what I also talk about, I think, in that Sick Society newsletter is just like there's just like no amount of money I could have to pay for the lack of like people who were there to consistently hear and witness my story. So like having to pay for therapists all the time, or the lack of touch that we experience in society, like having to pay for massage in order to have that need met. Like there's just like no amount of like the cascade of needs that we need as humans that aren't being met because we live in such a deep story of separation and individualism, that I think I just have so much personal grieving to do around, like the grieving of like whatever my childhood was and the trauma I experienced there. And like really grieving it, like actually, I don't know, contending with that instead of just like, I mean, not over pathologizing and making everything about my childhood or whatever, but like at least to some extent, like actually seeing like what stopping would allow me to actually uncover and to experience real grief that might allow me to actually imagine what I want to do with my future, who I would like to be with, like all of those things. And I thought that was just so profound to think about. yeah, like perhaps we can't imagine a new way to be because we haven't actually properly grieved what it means that we can't have children, that
Gosh,
we, yeah, that we're so sick, like all of these things.
that really hits. And I think, I don't know, this last year has been a year of grieving for me. I went in to 2022 and I wanted to feel it fully and let it go. I didn't want to be stuck in a childhood as a pathology. And that
Mm-hmm.
was a really big piece of this year for me, and something that I hadn't been able to get out of. And I wanted to get out of it. Like
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to get out of it. And to get
Mm-hmm.
out of it, I had to go through it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
and I think that is the hard thing about grief, that you can't indefinitely put it off, that at some point you have to let it wash over you. You have to let it drown you for a minute.
Yeah. Yeah. The falling apart. I think as a person who has been like so in like a learned way of being from my childhood and everything else that like is in a state of control, which I think is a state of separation. I often tell Kyle and Lauren that I feel like my sickness is actually control. Like the root of it actually feels like that's what it is, which is just another way I think of saying separation. That I'm separated from my own intuition. I'm separated from the trust in the universe to take care of me. That I'm separated from the safety I actually have in living in a universe that is constantly taking care of nature at all times.
Mm-hmm.
And I am part of that. Yeah. And so I often describe that as the actual root of my sickness. And yeah, it feels like I'm in a period of time where I'm actually needing to contend with that in a real way.
Yeah.
And it's why like Kyle last week when they said all the hard things to me, we're like, the whole Brittany, I think you sort of like, I think you're pretty clear about knowing what you want to do in the world. I think part of the reason you can't seem to make it work, like actually make it financially sustainable or find people who are around you to support doing all the things that you don't necessarily want to do to make it work. Like perhaps you've maybe come across someone who's like really inspired by your work, but they feel this sense of like you making everything into work that turns them off. So like you're actually maybe denying the support that might be available to you if you actually contend with whatever that is in you. And Kyle was like, I think maybe you just need to have a conversation with your dad. And I was like, oh no. He started naming like all of the like conversations that are like the deepest level of avoidance in your life. Like basically the only path to healing is having all the conversations you've been avoiding always.
Oh,
And I was like, oh, gross.
oh, that makes me feel ill.
Yeah.
Maybe, maybe.
Maybe.
And I am really interested in like, what does it mean to not overanalyze and go into every little
Nook and
thing?
cranny.
And
Yeah.
yeah, that I don't have to unearth and excavate every piece of hurt, every wound. I can just allow it to
Yeah.
to feel it, and to feel it not just in my head, but to feel it in my body. Like
Yeah.
what does grief have to say in my body? What texture is it? What color is it? How does it feel? Is it sharp? Is it soft? Is it spiky? Is it velvety? Like what is that experience, grief, inside my body? Because as somebody who wants to pull out everything and analyze it in my brain, a lot of what I've been doing lately is pulling stuff down. And how do I experience this in my body and maybe transmute it? How do I alchemize it? How do I take this grief that I'm feeling, this concavity in my chest that feels spiky, and turn it into something else, and lean into what that concavity wants? Does it want to, and this is really woo and whatever, but does it want to dance? Does it want to run outside in the grass like a fox and pounce on things? Like what movement does that grief want? Instead of this constant need that I experience to tease out every piece of what it could be. And I think as people that are constantly seeking that root cause, that's part of our story, is to look for that, which is beautiful. And what could it look like if we just experienced grief?
Yeah. Yeah, it's because I think even when I think about the idea, like I recall that my first sort of internal response after going ugh to Kyle's suggestion of having all those hard conversations was a compulsion to be like, and compulsion is the perfect word, compulsion to like schedule all those conversations like next week, like let's go, which is the same way I was, approaching my healing that was like too much at once. And so, like you're saying, yes, maybe. And how about I just like sit still for a second? And
Yeah.
yeah. And we always like to joke too, Kyle, Lauren, and I, that line from, there's a line in Dune that's the life is not a, I'm going to get it wrong, but it's something to the effect of life is not a, it's something like life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced. Which I think is definitely one of the most
That's
profound
beautiful.
lines in that whole movie.
Yeah.
But it's basically like Taoism. Like
Yeah.
it's just like, just be in the flow, and flow is in a lot of contrast to control. And so it's pretty difficult for me to stop and just flow.
Me too.
Instead of
Me too.
going and going and going.
All of the healing modalities that I've really turned to in the last year have been very strange, and they have made the biggest impact. And there are two that really come to mind that were really unexpected. And one has been exploring feminine and masculine embodiment work.
You don't say.
Yeah.
I have things to say about that.
Do you? Do you?
Yeah.
Okay. And this idea of flow, that I am constantly in this over analytical, very like masculine view of the world. And this really came up. I had this hip injury that prevented me from doing my daily walking. That's so important to me. Showed up in my right hip, which in energy worlds, the hip is the rumination, right? Like it's our energy that's kind of getting stuck in this whirlpool of masculine energy.
My right hip hurts right now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And so exploring what it means to maybe let go and to be more in that sort of feminine aspect of flow that is so elusive to me, and to cultivate practices around pretending that I'm in flow until maybe it feels that way.
Yeah.
And the second thing was, and this is very wild. So I've had stomach problems since I was a little kid. And I have pernicious anemia, which I think anybody with chronic fatigue should check for, and stomach issues. So pernicious anemia is really atrophic autoimmune gastritis. And so it's an autoimmune attack of the parietal cells in our stomach that make both hydrochloric acid, which is super important for breaking down nutrients and all of these things, and can also be an impetus for things like heartburn, having low stomach acid.
I've been taking HCl.
Great. That's great.
It's at least an interim.
But they also make intrinsic factor, which is part of the conversion of B12 to its usable form from dietary sources in the body. And so I tested positive for both intrinsic factor and anti-parietal cell antibodies last year and began taking some B12. And I have a little bit of a different opinion of this now than I did then, but it did change my life doing these intramuscular injections of B12. But these stomach aches persisted. And I was really wondering, like, what is going on with these stomach aches? And a friend of ours out here does zero energy balancing. I don't know. He pulls out a table.
Kate. It's okay.
He pulls out a table and he does stuff, but he doesn't really touch you. Okay. And he's a very intuitive man. And he said, when I first met you, I noticed something about you. And I never like to just like come up to people and say like, hey, I noticed this crazy thing about your energy. And he's like, but if you want to talk about it, I'm here and I'd like to talk about it. He came over for dinner one night and I was like, okay, lay it on me. And he's like, well, I can see that you were stabbed in your stomach in a past life. And I was like, okay, this is a little outside of my normal box, but okay.
Mm-hmm.
And months later, I was just kind of like, huh, that's interesting. I hadn't really considered much in that regard. And he
Mm-hmm.
came to do some energy work because I was like, hey, whatever. And he was like, I really want to work with your stomach. And I wanted to work with this stuck feeling that I was experiencing, like I had lost this, like there was a dam on a little creek and I had lost this aspect of flow. And so I decided to lean in, like, hey, if we're going to do this, we're going to really do this. And I like went into a really meditative state. I invited all past lives, all ancestors, like, come, let's heal. And I really worked on being open and being receptive and being in my body. And he did this hour-long energy work session. He barely touched me, touched my ankles and pulled
Mm-hmm.
them a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And my stomach hasn't hurt since then. It's been 5 months.
Yeah.
Super wild.
I'm gonna do my best to only out myself and not out anyone else because these are related to some of my friends too. But yeah, I've been doing some craniosacral work that sounds relatively similar. And a close friend of mine, which shall go unnamed, has started doing it before me and has been through more sessions than I have. But yeah, has had a lot of I guess what I would call energetic clearings that were similar, that were like, oh, in a past life, such and such. And it was like all of a sudden things started moving in their life after that, which made it sort of undeniable in a way. But yeah, so I'm into it. I think too that like my friends and I often, I think we've just gotten to a place where we realize like if anything is sick, it's at like the foundational, like the root cause of anything is actually spiritual. It's not just physical as like the manifestation of whatever is going on spiritually. And so, yeah, all of this like emotional and spiritual work feels like the actual root of what's going on, which is why I describe like my actual sickness as like control or separation or whatever. Like it's just another,
I
my
think that's
own
beautiful
version of separation. But yeah, in terms of the male and female, right after moving, I started doing more acupuncture and some other things that were like, I think one of the first times I was on his table, he was like, the acupuncturist was like, wow, feels like the whole right side of your body is just like overdeveloped energetically. Like it's just like sort of on fire. And I was like, well, that's super interesting because all of my symptoms show up on the right side of my body. And then I was doing some chiropractic work. Well, and he also mentioned like he was like, do you have mom issues? And I was like, oh man. Who are you? Get out of the room. So it was really interesting too, because I haven't really explored this too much yet, but he was like, who are you attracted to in the world? I was like, well, I'm like, he was like, cause you're queer, right? And I was like, yeah. And he was like, well, who do you tend to be attracted to? And I was like, well, pretty feminine women. And he was like, I was like, what? And he was like, I was like, oh my God, are you saying that I'm like overcompensating for something that's underdeveloped in myself? And I was like, oh, wow. Yikes.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't really sat with that too much. I don't know if I fully believe that, but I see aspects of that for sure. But then, yeah, so that happened. And then I started going to a chiropractor here who gets angry every time I refer to him as a chiropractor, as I feel like chiropractors are wont to do. But he calls himself, like he works on compensations. And so basically, as I'm sure you're aware of, but like the theory being that anything that might be symptomatic is showing up because it's a compensation that's making up for something else that's sort of happening somewhere else. And so then I started doing that and I was like, oh my God, it like metaphorically and literally physically started to make sense to me that I was like, all of the symptoms are showing up on the right side of my body, which is typically the masculine logic, etc. side. Mm-hmm. If that's actually a compensation, it must be true then that the like other side of me is underdeveloped. And so then spiritually, metaphorically, emotionally, physically, that the left side of me that is flow and femininity and all of those things have been, underutilized, underdeveloped, all of those things. And so I'm actually one of Lauren's closest friends is she's a life coach and also a genius at Myers-Briggs things. And I'm starting coaching with her on Wednesday in a couple days. And I'm basically referring to her as my yin coach. Like she's just an expert, I think, at
I
that
have
side
one.
of things.
I have
Amazing.
one. Yeah.
There you go.
I have a coach and she's my yin coach because that's
Yeah.
not my specialty.
Yeah. So I need a little bit of guidance to do that. But yeah, same thing. I feel like, and yeah, it's a mirror of the wider cultural thing, right? That it's been an over reliance on the masculine, logic, scientific, etc., and an under reliance or disrespect even for the feminine, mystical, woo, flow,
Yes.
divinity, intuition, like
Yes.
all of those things.
All of those things.
Yeah. And I'm sure, yeah, nature.
Nature.
Mother Nature.
Yeah, nature in all of her messy, chaotic, disorganized, juiciness.
Yeah.
And this has been one of the having this yin coach has been one of the hardest things I've ever had to access. And I'm the same. Many of my symptoms manifest on the right side of my body. And
Kate.
we have very, very similar health trajectories.
Yeah.
Very similar. And that's interesting.
Yeah, super interesting. Yeah, super interesting also that a mother wound is present for you.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, Angela runs a podcast also where she basically just reads her newsletter. Angela's the yin coach I'm starting to go to. And a couple months ago, she had rightfully, she only produces podcasts and newsletters on the new moon. And
Beautiful.
yeah. And she put one out a couple months ago that was this whole story that she heard from somewhere else. I'm not going to do a good job of recounting it, but that was this like person who had, I don't know if it was like a near-death experience. I can't remember what it was, but some story where this person had some sort of vision of like afterlife. Like they were in the afterlife. And they like encountered this, like what seemed like a guide of some sort. Like, I don't know if it was like an angel or a spirit or whatever you want to call it. And the person like looked down. I feel like it was some story about like looking down on earth or looking down and seeing some group of people or something. And there were these people who were like brick by brick, sort of like laying road. And they were just like working and working and working, laying these bricks. And the person asked the guide, like the spirit who was there, like, who are these people and what are they doing? And the response was something like, oh, those are the like, this isn't the right word, but it was like, oh, those are the overworkers. Like they think that they have to do everything on their own. So they spend all their energy just like plodding along, making things really difficult. And we would like to intervene. Like we would like to help them out, but we won't do it unless they ask. So we just like watch them exhaust themselves basically. And I was like,
oh, yeah, that I don't know that I feel a little bit too called out on that one.
I know. I was like, I stopped the car. I think I was like, whoa, pause, pull over. Thanks, Angela. That really got me. I was like, yeah, that feels like, yeah, a great example of what I do. Like, I think I spend my life feeling so exhausted because I feel like,
and alone. I'm just gonna add to that.
Yeah, thanks for adding that in there.
Sorry, no, this is for me, and I wasn't adding that. I don't want you to think I was adding that for you.
No, like, it's like it's accurate
and alone.
Yeah, it's accurate. I mean, because when I talk about, we're just gonna, and if we publish this, welcome audience to my deepest wounding, but yeah, like when I'm in periods of real struggle, like emotional or whatever. Like, let's say I'm really sad because like if I've not dated for a while, when I feel really alone, like I think part of one of my like internal responses is to go like, I just want someone to like fucking help. Like I just want to not be the only one who's doing everything. Like I'm so exhausted by life that I'm like so isolated and so alone and constantly having to do everything on my own. And first of all, what a terrible reason to need a partner. I mean, interdependence and all, like I'm not saying that we don't need people, but like putting some sort of pressure on other people to fill that deep lack is actually just a lack because I'm not actually giving it to myself. Like, but yeah, when I'm in times of real struggle, like my deepest sort of response is an internal feeling that I'm just like, I'm terribly alone and so isolated and so fucking exhausted because I'm just having to do everything on my own. Meanwhile, the universe is just somewhere above me or around me or in me or whatever going like, hey, we'd like to give you a hand and make things easier, but you're going to actually have to stop controlling everything first and believe that you're not alone because we're here to help. Like you might actually find ease and joy and lightness and synchronicity and all of those things if you actually just stopped and realized that there are people and spirit or ancestors or whatever around to help you.
Yeah. And
Here I
leaning
am,
into
tired.
that trust fall, right? With the universe, with God, whatever you want to call it, which is a new hat for me to wear, right? We talked about the spiritual component, and leaning into that trust fall feels really hard. That's with it, and I think you were dead on, right? It's in me, it's above me, it's around, it's everywhere. It is the pulse of rightness at my being that tells me that I am connected to every other thing inside the universe through forces both seen and unseen. And to let that be and to tap into it, to maybe ask for help. I got lucky. I married the most helpful man on earth. And he is beautiful both in his ability to help, but also his ability to ask for help with he brings nothing into it. I bring, if I ask for help, I bring shame. And I bring, not good enough. And I bring, I just bring this whole party.
I'm a burden.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
An imposition.
Yeah.
I bring a whole party to ask for
I'm
help.
too much. Right? Like it's too much.
And my
I need
husband
too much.
gives and asks freely. My husband is my greatest. He is one of my biggest life teachers. All the flow that I do not have, this man has, and he's just something else, which is for another time. But
love that for you.
Watching help manifest, and having trust, I think, is another piece of that something is broken there, my relationship with trust, which is, it's my mother.
Right. But that's what I mean, I think that's like the same, the other side of the coin as safety. So I think I said that earlier too, is that like my gut issues, my nervous system, my control, my compulsion to control or whatever at its core, I think, is a spiritual belief that I'm not safe.
Yes.
And that really is like what you and I think talk about all the time in different ways, which is like a disconnection from nature, that somehow I don't see myself as part of nature, because if I did, I would realize that, I mean, this is biblical, right? This is where I think I've been sort of my own sort of reconnection to spirituality, or I guess like spirituality has always been a part of who I am, but I think in my own story that was like growing up in the South and Texas, and I started going to church late in high school, and then promptly stopped going to church right around the time I came out. And there's a whole story there, but I've been reconnecting with that, and specifically Christianity, because it is part of my larger story. And for me, part of that has just been realizations that like there are lines in the Bible that are like, why do you spend, basically, this is a riff on it, but like basically, why do you spend so much time working when like the lilies of the field are taken care of? Like, or, like I care for every blade of grass. Like, why would I not care for you, sorts of things? And so I think a reconnection to that, and being like, whatever I believe, like whatever I label it, God, spirit, universe.
I think it's all the same to me.
It's all the same.
Going back to the same thing.
That it's been like, I don't know if shocking is the right word, but surprising for sure, to be like, oh my God, all these things that I learned, like in my younger adulthood about Christianity and spirituality, because I don't think those are things that are just within Christianity necessarily, but like all these things I learned in a very particular language that I stopped being comfortable with speaking, that kind of religion particularly, all of a sudden are coming back to me, but in ways that aren't dogmatic. Like there are ways that are like, oh shit, I remember reading that. And now it like actually resonates at like a core level where I'm like, oh, like the thing about sin, or yeah, just like a deep realization that like the universe has you.
There's
Is
this,
like healing my wounds around safety.
yeah. And I think that I think that's critical, is that we find the sense of safety. Like we are meant to heal, and we are meant to feel safe. I'm curious, and I have to ask you this. I've lately found that all
I
of
love when you say it like that, because then all of a sudden it sounds like I'm on your podcast.
well, I know, I thought we were just shooting the shit.
No, we are. I know, but like
This is just shooting the shit.
I love how you go into phrases like that, because then I'm like, ooh, now I'm in the question seat.
Lately, all roads for me have led back to things that I was deeply interested in as a teenager. And this has just been in the last 3 or 4 months. I started college right after I turned 16, and was initially going to major in physics. Wow. And was really interested in quantum physics. I was a wacky teen.
Oh my God. We might talk for the rest of time. Not today. I'm just saying we're going to be long friends. We have too much to talk about.
Yeah. And I was interested in all of this. I read all these books on quantum physics and all of these things, and I kind of lost it along the way, right? College went on for a little too long, and I got a little lost because I'm a generalist, right? The Epstein idea of I'm just too interested in too many things. College was like a smorgasbord that I couldn't fully handle of knowledge. And I lost some of these things, and I've come back to it, and all of a sudden, we talk so much about the inner child, but I think there's also an inner teen that is equally important, and that there's some differences between the two, like what that 5 to 8-year-old Kate needs to feel safe and to feel creative and to feel held is different than what 16-year-old Kate needs. And all of a sudden, I've just rediscovered all of these interests, and I'm like, maybe I was right all along, and just have kind of taken this big circle back around. And as you were talking about that, I heard a little bit of maybe that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of similar to the I don't know, evolutionary biology maybe that you were talking about in part too, that like Lauren put it in this really beautiful way. I think she heard from somewhere else recently. It was, I'm sure you've heard different models of or different language for, but like that sort of early childhood development is synthesis. You start to form who you are in the world and what you believe, and you're using a lot of external things like your parents and like authority figures to sort of help determine that. And then you go through antithesis. So in your teenage years, that you're rebelling against all of these things in a way, and in a lot of way, you sort of have to throw the baby out with the bathwater in order to establish your own grounding in what you believe. And then, hold on, maybe I got this wrong. What is the third one? Shit. It's some form of integration. I can't remember if actually the third one is synthesis. I think the third one might be synthesis. I forget what the early one is. Oh, thesis. So it's thesis. That's where you're like, determining what you believe. And then antithesis in your teenage years. And then in adulthood, ideally, you come back around to synthesis. So you're able to like actually synthesize all of these things that.
I love that.
Yeah, I think it's really beautiful. Which I follow, like a comedian, like Pete Holmes, who talks about this also. Like he also came from like a childhood in Christianity, went through a major divorce when his wife cheated on him, and then went through like a, oh my God, I don't know what I believe. And then now is sort of like talks about Ram Dass and Alan Watts, and like every comedian who comes on his podcast, he talks about spirituality with, so it's like finding, I think for me, I'm seeing, and I was telling Lauren and Angela also actually that like I love, I don't know if you've ever seen Chef's Table on Netflix.
No, which I it always felt like work.
Yeah, I could see that for you. Um, they are gorgeously shot. Like they're just very beautiful. But like one of the things I've always found that I love about them in like being a storyteller and realizing the story that's going on, I see a pattern in almost every episode that is a person who in their early years, grows up in their home country. Let's call it Peru. Establishes their own like cultural identity, like what they learned from their culture. And then in their antithesis often does something that's like, I have to go to France to learn like, real culinary school and like become a real chef, and reject basically everything that I learned in my early childhood and my home culture. And then basically these chefs all become famous because what they do is integrate these very specific, unique, beautiful things about their past that they learned from their home culture with high technique of some sort. And technique can look like fire in a backyard. It doesn't necessarily have to be like expert chopping skills or whatever. And I just think it's another model of that same thing that is, I think, in adulthood, starting to synthesize these things. And what becomes really beautiful is actually, I think, that process of reclaiming all this stuff that you learned when you were younger, that at the time, like at least in your antithesis years, your teenage years, don't feel like you can hold. And maybe that's, I think, part of the like this plus that thing for me is like a complexity is actually getting to a place where you can hold that like, there are some real problems with things like Christianity. There are some real harms that are caused by that. There are real harms that it caused me. But like, does it have to mean that none of it's true? And like, how much more powerful then to have like actually gone through a real process of that, to then be able to come back to society and be like, here's the wisdom I've gained, and integrating all of these things and reclaiming Christianity or like anything in a way that like actually feels empowering rather than harmful and disempowering, and makes it your own unique brand of like what you have to offer the world.
I think that's so beautiful. I mean, you're alchemizing, because you are a mirror for society and the wounds that have occurred right in that space. You're alchemizing that, and you're coming back with something that is healed. And I think that is very reflective, a lot of ways of healing intergenerational trauma too.
Yeah.
And part of what it means to truly begin to shift a paradigm, because you are able to come home, but you come home with new ideas. And I know, Wes Jackson talks about this idea of homecoming in the sense of farming, but I also think that there are other ideas, other modalities that we come home to, and even just ourselves as a space that like we can come home to our bodies, we can come home to our inner children. This journey of connecting with inner child and inner teen has looked like, painting ponies one night and, researching quantum physics the next night. Coming home to Kate, yes. Whatever that means.
Yeah.
But yeah, there is this sense of homecoming with this alchemization of, I have taken the cognitive dissonance that I experience in not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but instead looking at where the problems might lie and still finding a sense of connection with this thing, whatever that is.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been super powerful for me. And like you used the word earlier, transmuting, it's like compost, alchemy, like all those things. Like how do we integrate those things back in to create richer soil?
compost as transmutation that's great.
All right. Compost as transmutation. That is what is up, right? So that was my first conversation with Kate Kavanaugh. I hope you enjoyed it. Of course, the second conversation is currently published also. You can go listen to that and chew on that slowly and eat all of the yummy things that we have to say. That conversation specifically is about the intersections of meat plus health. I know, folks, but bear with me. Kate has some magical things to say about how those things are connected. And it's an incredible conversation. I can't wait for you to hear. For now, you can also find Kate online at anywhere that she can be found online by checking out the description of this show in whatever player that you're listening on, or by going to the show notes on my site at thisplusthat.com/episodes. Links to everything that we talked about as well can be found there as well. Thisplusthat.com is also where you can sign up for the This Plus That newsletter, where you'll get more behind the scenes related content and personal insights from me. I have slowed down a lot on writing that newsletter. In fact, I haven't written it in a few months. So know that I don't send often, but when I do, I try to make sure that it's meaningful and nutrient dense, just like all of these conversations. And as you heard me talk about in this episode with Kate, I am just sitting with what a break looks like for me. So I haven't been writing much recently, but I would love for you to sign up for that. It's where you will get behind the scenes stuff for the podcast and also my writing when I am writing. So you can also find me elsewhere online at This Plus That Pod on Twitter and Instagram. And if you feel grateful for this work, you can drop me a tip or become a monthly supporter by going to my website and clicking support. Whether you support me financially or not, you get equal access to all of my content. But if you feel inspired to give to me financially, these are just a couple of ways that I open myself up to receiving gifts in return. And yeah, it's how I build a relationship with you, is you signing up for my things, you sharing this. Even again, like if you're not supporting financially, a huge way that you can help is by sharing this with other people or rating it 5 stars on your favorite app, like wherever you listen to the podcast, and give it a review. I love, actually, Kate does this on her podcast. She writes personal notes to all of the people who give her a review and send her a screenshot of it. So if you do that, I would love to send you maybe a video. Also, I'll send you a personal shout out in a video over email maybe, and say hi to you and just connect with you that way. I love Kate sort of inspired me to do that. So yeah, share it with your friends, other people who like mashing weird things together and talking about the nature of the universe. And yeah, rate it and do all those things. Those are other ways that you can help me continue to do this. And yeah, I just want to give a quick thanks also, of course, to my podcast management team, the Podcast Babes, for helping to get this episode out in the world. I know that they have to chunk through these very dense conversations to help me do that. So thanks to them. You can find links to them also in the episode description and in the show notes, of course. And otherwise, just thank you for listening. It means a lot to me that we can be here in this space together, considering these things around work and rest and eating and nutrition and yeah, the way that the world mirrors us and we mirror the world back and all of those things. So please go check out the next conversation with Kate, episode 25 on the intersections of meat plus health. You can also, again, listen to Kate and her podcast, Groundwork. We have actually cross-posted this episode there, but Kate is going to interview me soon, and that's going to be on her podcast in the near future. So make sure you subscribe to Groundwork as well. All right, until next time, everybody.